So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining. I know this is like the tail end of the second day, so I'm glad you're still here, actually. But today we're going to be talking about how we can explore, right, even as content changes or priorities or policies change, how we can still make sure government side experiences are championing a sense of welcome. So I'm Bruna Siqueira-Davis. I'm a senior digital strategist at Evolving Web. Evolving Web is a full-service digital agency. We have folks kind of all over the globe, but our headquarters are in Montreal, so you'll see some Canadian examples today. But I, for one, am from Charlotte, North Carolina, and we have lots of US-based clients too. So if you've heard of us, we have some cool things to brag about. The biggest one, I think, for me that I wanted to mention today is the Evolve Digital Series. That's an event series that we put on. It kind of moves between cities. The next one is in New York in November, and I'll have a slide about that at the very end, in case that's something you want to join. So, for the agenda, we'll talk about a little bit the introduction to the problem, which I think folks are probably pretty familiar with. Then we'll have a grounding framework that I'll share. We'll talk a little bit about why it matters. We'll spend most of our time on what you can do about it, and then talk, kind of final takeaways. So, as I'm sure some of you are familiar, what's going on with government sites in the US? So now let's go on imagine this exploration, right? Maybe you don't work in government and you're in this scenario, and you have to go to a government website, right, as a constituent, and maybe you're checking for a benefit that you qualify for, but then the information you need is gone, right? No explanation, there's no next step, it's just not there. And I think that's kind of what we're facing right now, right? So a lot is happening, especially on a federal level with government websites. And when you think about that, right, there's a lot that is changing. And this is, just in the past year. So what are we looking at? This is an article from, I think, February, from the Washington Post that kind of was cataloging a lot of the pages that had come down since there were executive changes that kind of led to shifts. And essentially, right, a lot of content has been removed, and a lot of content has been added. A lot of messages are new. So really what we want to focus on today is how can we make sure that even if those things are outside of our control, that we can build inclusion in other ways, right? So I really want you to understand, hopefully when you leave, your levers, right? Like what you can actually control when policies change, how you can build inclusion in other ways, to learn from peers and some examples and get some actionable insights. Some assumptions. I'm assuming a lot of you probably work in government, if not maybe in digital agencies that work with government, or maybe higher ed or nonprofit, etc. So in some ways you've probably already encountered change. If you're here, I hope you have a commitment to inclusion. And I want to be really cognizant of the fact that I know a lot of folks are working with a lot less resources because of budget cuts and team cuts, etc. So hopefully that will get us to a place where you can get some good insight. But I do want to caveat, I don't have the magic answer to, make work easier when you have way less teams, or to really move beyond some of the mandates that have happened. But hopefully these are small ways that we can kind of move towards keeping and ensuring an inclusive experience. So first of all, though, a bit of psychology. So this is kind of our grounding framework. Has anybody ever heard of this, like the spheres of influence? Okay, Rich has heard about it. Thank you, Rich. It's a psychological concept, so sometimes you might hear about it in therapy, but it's starting to be used also in product settings, right? So the idea is that the outer circle is the circle of concern. So these are things that worry you, but you have no control over. And then there's the circle of influence. So these are things you can shape indirectly, often over time, but they're not in your direct control. And then there's your circle of control, right? What is in your control? So thinking about this model and maybe your own websites that you manage or digital services, what's maybe one thing you can't change, one thing you can influence, and one thing you can control, right? So when thinking about how we can focus on the right things, right, in the circle of concern, right, you may not have agency or control over, at least in your professional capacity, right, over high-level funding decisions or policies or legislative mandates or political priorities. And so that is kind of one of the hardest losses, right? Especially when you're losing some important identity-affirming or evidence-based or equity-focused content, that can be a hard thing to kind of come to terms with. But where you can really make the most impact is that circle of influence, in part, right? So these are things that you can still have some influence about. So things like that include how leadership understands digital best practices, some awareness of user needs within your organization, cross-team collaboration and buy-in, and then also ultimately, you can have some influence over the public perception of your site's usefulness. Where we have the real power is in that circle of control, and that's where we'll talk about tactics the most today. So those are things like, right, the language we use, clarity, transparency, structure, navigation, and how we have these micro moments of inclusion that signal to folks that they're still wanted, right, as a recipient of a benefit or whatever the service is, and that they're ultimately, right, still welcome here. So why does it matter? I mean, the stakes are pretty big, right? Depending on the site that you work on, you may serve hundreds to millions of people. And at the end of the day, regardless of how things are shifting, folks still need to access services that are offered by our government. So it is, it's a big deal to have these types of roles where you have control over that. But we can still create, I think, even though, right, inconsistencies, exclusion, and content gaps kind of break down user trust, we can still try to earn that in some other ways. So what signals belonging, essentially, when words themselves are taken away, right? And that'll be kind of the topic throughout. So what can you do? I'll have like a kind of 4 key areas we'll focus on, but we'll start with 1. One is about transparently communicating change, right? Ultimately, policy is going to determine content scope, but you can still determine the experience. So really thinking about how you communicate change and how you can maximize transparency. So when we think about change, there's 2 ways we can think about it, right? There are changes that are swift and unplanned, so they happen quickly. Maybe they're triggered, right, by policy shifts, executive orders, urgent events. And the messaging might be constrained, right, by time or just limits of what you're legally allowed to put up. But there's also planned and proactive change, and we're going to talk about examples in both types today. So one, right, might be one where you don't have a ton of control, but for planned and proactive things, you may have a little bit more control to be able to influence that. So a quick example, we'll talk about the swift changes first of HHS changes. So Health and Human Services controls a lot of different sites. We'll talk about the CDC website today. But essentially, right, back in January, executive orders were issued. Content was swiftly removed to kind of comply with that. And then a group of doctors actually sued and said, we rely on this information that you have taken down. And a judge says, temporarily, please reinstate this content. And the content is kind of reinstated with disclaimers. And then ultimately, right, the lawsuits continue because it was temporary that the content was reinstated. So the future of the content is uncertain. But this is an example of one of the pages, right? So when the content was in that temporary place where it was reinstituted, and this is how it is today, it comes with this warning, right? And this is a situation where there's not a ton of control of site managers, etc., in the language that's used here, because this was something that was decided by the court in this lawsuit that in part of reinstating this content, this disclaimer had also was required to be included, right? And obviously the disclaimer and the language that it uses is partisan, right? It's not, it can be divisive depending on how you think about it and where you stand on things like this. But essentially, right, it meets a compliance requirement, but it's not really offering any context or next step or even clarity, right? So it says the website's required to restore it as of February, but not really a lot of timeline on are we going to get to keep this content or anything like that. So the absence of guidance here, I think, is the thing that stands out to me as a usability risk, right? Because now doctors have to figure out, I think in the filing of the lawsuit, one doctor talked about how they use information on the CDC website about prescribing PrEP to patients. And when that was taken down, they're like, I can find the information on other places, but that cuts majorly into the time I can spend with patients because I have to cobble together all these sources. So there's also opportunities, I think, to be, even in swift changes, somewhat proactive. So the website for climate.gov was one of the sites that completely came down after some mandates. I don't know if you saw the headline earlier on, but the headline was basically, the whole team was fired, so there's nobody to manage the site. It was taken down. A couple good things to pay attention to in this one is, first and foremost, I think this is a thing that you can be thinking about as things evolve and maybe different mandates come out, is how you're redirecting, right, from these 404 pages, etc. So one thing that climate.gov team did really well is that they were able to redirect to the NOAA website, which now has this content. And you can kind of see here in the NOAA website that they have also a message, right? So for them, this wasn't a legal compliance requirement, right? They put this up proactively, which I think is a really good thing. But I think where this kind of leaves a gap in meeting user needs is that it's pretty jargony. It's very informational, right? It tells you exactly the executive orders that it's in compliance with, so maybe you can go look them up. But it has a lot of, right, as a user, that's kind of overwhelming to look at. And not only that, but I think from a visual perspective, so we also are going to talk about how we visually represent content to make people really be able to understand it and use it. But it doesn't have any sort of like visual weight that differs it from the rest of the content on the page, so it can kind of be missed. Now, this is probably maybe the best example that I found, but it's not necessarily perfect. So the Department of Justice, they have an Office of Justice Programs, and their disclaimer, right, is vague, and I think that's the thing that I wish I could change. But visually it stands out, right, you notice it. And they talk about how they're reviewing their websites in accordance with the executive orders. Maybe they could offer a bit more context or some links to some of those actual orders. But then, right, they say during this review, some pages will be unavailable. We apologize for the inconvenience. So they're at least kind of taking some accountability or whatnot for the fact that, like, this might cause issues for you because they're in the process of reviewing. But I think the positive of it is at least they're offering a bit of context so that you know, right, what to expect. And then we have planned and proactive change, right? So that's a different approach, and it's a different kind of set of challenges. I think a lot of times, especially working on websites like we do, we assume that if we're rolling out a good change, right, like we've invested a lot of time in some UX enhancements or whatever, that there's no need to communicate it because it's a net positive for users. But that's not the case. So I wanted to talk about one of our clients, climatedata.ca. They are partly a combination of regional climate organizations, but also the Canadian government's kind of Bureau on Climate Science. And so essentially what the site provides, it's not climate advice or anything like that, but just data and projections about climate. So this is their map interface currently. For example, you can also download data, etc. And soon, next month, they'll be rolling out a new experience that we've worked with them on that is actually changing a lot of the site, enhanced navigation, obviously this new interface that has like help kind of markers that the old one didn't, and an easier download section. And I think what's been really cool about working with them is that they wanted to be really proactive about communicating the changes that were coming, right? So we worked with them to kind of look at how we could create a campaign essentially to message priorities, right? So we had two audiences, current platform users and prospective and new users. And so really we'll focus on talking about current platform users, right? So the messaging that prioritizes education and retention, right? So we wanted folks who rely on this tool for their professional work. So the audience is often city planners or architects, right? Folks who have to take into account kind of the climate history and also projections in order to build a resilient future, I guess, for us. And anyways, so we wanted to explain for that audience the improvements and how they'll benefit, and then also reassure them that they won't lose functionality. So what we actually were able to do is we started with an internal key messages document, right? So we had a little bit of a workshop call where we talked about what does this launch mean, what is it actually delivering for users, etc. And so we created this as a place of alignment for us, right? Like what are the messages that we want to deliver to others, and had a collaborative ability to kind of edit and get to a place where we're happy with it. And then from that, we created other items, right? So a press release with FAQs, some FAQs directly targeted at, I already use this platform, what's changed? A how-to blog, which there's a little bit of a sneak peek of some of the drafts. That kind of goes step by step into the core areas that they changed and how you can use them. So for example, there's a section about, here's how you use the Maps interface, here's how you use downloads, and here's all the new functionality we've rolled out for the Learning Zone content that they have. And it's less so about, saying like, this is a filter and you can click it here, but trying to give them scenarios of real world use cases. We're also going to be doing a special edition of their newsletter, right? So a lot of the folks who engage with their platform daily are already subscribed to their channels, and so they've really capitalized on the channels that they have a little bit of ownership over to be able to roll out communications and try to do that broadly. Another example I wanted to touch on quickly is one that I found through research trying to prep this presentation, and it's the United States Department of Labor. So you can see kind of in this screenshot here at the bottom, it has a call to action for explore new functionality. And then if you scroll down on the page a little bit, right, they also have explore the new DOL.gov beta site. And what was really cool about this is that the site is not live yet, right? And it's a positive change, right? They've made a lot of improvements to what the site looks like, how it's structured, but they're still giving users the opportunity to weigh in, offer feedback, and kind of get used to the new site that they're going to offer. So this is actually a screenshot from the beta site that you can click into, and you can see the changes are excellent, right? They're now kind of targeting by journeys and audiences, and it's really cool. And they know right at the bottom, this is still under development, so be careful, like this, don't take everything in here as fact. And they actually create the opportunity to provide feedback. So I think, obviously in a time when teams may be smaller, this may become less of a priority because there's lots of resources that have the bandwidth to do this. But I think this is a really important way to collect feedback before you make something, even if it's a good change, the new reality for folks. So, communicating change checklist. This is the summary of our first point of offering transparency. Announce changes as early as you can. Obviously, sometimes that's not in your control and you won't be able to, but if you do things proactively as much as possible, that'll help. And again, we stress this, right, but even good changes should be communicated to users. Repeat messages across different channels that you have control over. Use plain language, which we'll talk about quite a bit in a second. Give sneak peeks to kind of reduce surprise, kind of like the Department of Labor website. And then provide a clear next step for users. And if possible, invite some feedback. So, second point I wanted to cover today is designing content for clarity and support. So even when you have limits, language and visuals, you're still going to have those on your site, right? Some language may change, but you can still signal welcome, empathy, and user care with those things. So I think a really important piece of this is plain language. And when I hear plain language, I think right before digging into all of this and, my professional career, my first instinct is like, oh, it's just using, simple words, making it simple and clear. And the reality is that it's a lot more layered, right? So especially if you're working in a federal context, there's actually a law probably that you're aware of that you have to comply with, which is the Plain Writing Act of 2010. But there's this really great website, and they have a lot of awesome resources on it, plainlanguage.gov, that you can check out, and they have training recordings and all of this great stuff. But essentially what plain language actually means in this context is communication where the wording, the structure, and the design of the information are so clear that an audience can really easily find what they need, understand what they find the first time, and use what they find to meet their needs, right? So it goes beyond just wording, which I think usually is most people's first instinct, and it also includes structure and design, right? So that's plain language kind of in the middle. So the basics of it, right? For wording, use familiar words. This is probably the part that's going to seem most familiar or obvious to folks. But avoiding jargon, acronyms, and legalese when you can, keeping sentences short and active, and trying to use, I think this is one of the most important ones, a human tone, right? So speaking directly to users, certainly depending on the type of website that you run and the content and the audience, it may not be as appropriate to be more casual, but I think for a lot of public-facing benefits, it's an advantage. So quick examples of this, right? So it's not quite right if we have a sentence like this, and I'll tell you why. So applicants must submit the completed benefits eligibility determination form no later than 14 calendar days following the receipt of the notification letter. You can probably understand that, but it's a bit of a mouthful, right? So you can reduce things and simplify, right? And say things like, send us your completed benefits form within 14 days of getting your letter, right? It doesn't have to be as complex, and it can be simplified. A couple tools to use if you're interested in doing this with some of your content. There is the Hemingway editor does a really good job of this, and quite honestly, I know probably everybody's AI'd out from all the sessions on AI, but ChatGPT and tools like that can be really helpful to try to get you to this place. I wanted to take it to stress a little bit, so when we think about wording, and talk about this idea of supportive language. So I think of it as a little bit of a step above just inclusive, or not inclusive, plain language, right? So I live in North Carolina, as I kind of shared at the beginning, and I have to every year, as I'm sure we all do, renew my vehicle registration, right? I said this in a different talk where I mentioned this. I'm not sponsored by the pay it people who run this platform, but if anybody knows them and they want to sponsor me, let me know. But I think it's a great experience, right? So basically, if I need to renew my vehicle registration, I click on that button that says vehicle registration renewal. And essentially what it creates is a chat interface. And it's not an AI chatbot, it's a very decision tree-based chatbot. But it is really great on mobile, one, which I think is excellent for users. But it's a very familiar interface just from a design perspective, right? We all probably use some sort of messaging app to communicate with folks that we know in our lives. And so there's something somewhat comforting and familiar about that. But the language I want you to pay attention to is it's so warm, right? So it says things like, sure thing, right? It feels like it's a human or an agent is standing with me, without the hassle of having to physically go into the DMV deal with all of that, especially because in North Carolina they've moved to an appointment system, and that's often booked out like 3 months in advance, and so it's very, very hard to actually be able to go in person. And then right after that, it kind of goes into a renewal checklist, right? So it talks about very visually, right? It breaks down the safety inspection, the emissions test, the vehicle information, and it gives me options at the bottom, if you notice, right, that I can choose from. So yes, renew, no, I'm missing something. If you click no, I'm missing something, it'll direct you to essentially contact information. But if you say yes, let's renew, it will go through and start asking you questions, right? So it says, okay, great, I'll need some information. The language is really plain and clear, and it can guide folks through not only reducing kind of the burden on teams who have to deal with this, right, firsthand, but making it easier for the user. But I think the thing that I really want to stress is the way that they use language, right? It's very interesting, and the way that this works, because it's not an AI chatbot, is that they come up with the language ahead of time to input here, and you can tell a lot of work has been done to ensure that the language is not just plain, but right, it feels human and supportive, like, okay, great, right? I can kind of feel a bit of a personality coming through. The second thing is structure, right? So the basics is that you want to put the most important information first. You've probably heard that. Use headings. We probably have all heard that, because especially for accessibility and SEO. And break text into short sections. So we'll talk about that for a bit. You want to present steps or requirements as bullets or numbered lists. I'm a big fan of this, and I'll show you an example. And if possible, use summaries to kind of break down key information before the details. So I, for one, have to file my taxes quarterly. And I don't mean to pick on the IRS, because I think they get a lot of flack already, and they're trying their best. But when I go on the IRS website several times a year, there's 2 things I'm looking for. The quarterly payment deadlines that I need to know, and the link to the payment portal. And I do this, like, I don't know, it's 4 quarters, but at least 6 times a year where I'm like, when is the deadline again? And then I go look for these things. I want to stress, this is nothing against the IRS, but the last thing I want to be doing is figuring this information out, right? Like, I have other things to do. I'm like, I would just want to get this done. And I think the experience for this page, right, which is usually the one I end up on when I Google estimated taxes, can have some room for improvement, right? So kind of going through the elements we had in talking about structure, right, does it put the most important information first? And I think that my assessment is kind of, right, it tells you who, I guess, needs to do this, but it's not very clear to me because there's not a lot of visual hierarchy or a heading or anything to tell me. The second is, does it use headings that clearly describe each section? Yes, I think this is the strongest piece of this page, is that it describes that information. Now, remember how I said I am always looking for the dates and the link to pay? Try to look and see if you can find those things while we're going through here. So does it break text into short sections? I think it tries to, but not super effectively, right? The sections sometimes are short sentences, but then they're long paragraphs, so it varies. And then does it represent or present steps or requirements as bullets or number lists? No, this reads very much like a wall of text to me. And then does it use summaries to present key information before the details? No. It does have some links at the top. Like one is like to a tax calendar, but the downside is like 3 clicks deep, and then I land in a calendar that's like all the tax dates, which I don't want to sift through. Right, so right now I'm kind of like, I think there's things that could be enhanced here, right? And I guess I wanted to ask, did folks find, it's a little bit easier when it's like giant and broken up into sections, but right, this was the first one, and then here was the other one. So I wanted to talk about this idea of chunking, right, which I think is one of the most powerful things maybe the IRS site could do, is that when you look at a dense paragraph like the one on the left, it's really overwhelming. But if you look at chunked content, right, you're using essentially cues that can help break content down. Now, obviously, this is something that's very visual, and not all of your users will be consuming your content, right, in a visual manner. But even if you are using a screen reader, adding things like this adds a bit of context for those users and structure that still can carry meaning for them, rather than them having to sit down and listen to their screen reader read the entire thing. Though I guess they do have the benefit of maybe being able to tab through links. One example that does this chunking super well is the Minnesota Benefits Finder. So they essentially have created a really nice website, and this is kind of the home page. There's other things above this, but in the screenshot you can kind of see, and they break down the steps to applying, right? So they kind of have a heading that tells you what it is, the text is short, it's pretty straightforward, and there's some visual cues with the icons. So that's an example that I think is a good one to mirror. And then last we have design, right? So when we think about design can mean so many things to so many different people. But this is not just about the structure of the information, which we talked about in the last section, but really about how the information looks. And again, this is less relevant maybe for some of your audiences who are using screen readers, but if a majority of your users, right, are consuming text by kind of reading it on the screen, this is something that's really valuable, right? So use of white space to avoid clutter. And this is not like an aesthetic use of white space, but it's more of a white space and spacing between elements, right? So I struggle with this a lot when I'm doing presentations, actually, because I really prefer to have space between bullet points because it helps me be able to read better. But the default, right, is that it doesn't skip the line, so I always have to like add line breaks. But all that to say, right, you can see kind of in the example that I pulled here from the web, right, the structure is the same between these two images, but when you add a visual hierarchy, right, of slightly bigger text or the blue, etc., these things kind of stand out and make it easier to read. And I think the next thing, right, is can the population you serve see themselves in the experience? Now, images are not completely outside of the impacted content that has been removed from government websites, but this is Medicare.gov. This is not one web page, by the way. This is like a bunch of different ones because that would be kind of confusing if it wasn't. But it showcases, as you can see, different types of people, right? So I can see myself reflected maybe in some of the pages when I see another Latina woman, right, potentially. And granted, I'm not the audience for this, but they showcase age, etc. And I think you always want to be careful to do this in a way that is not tokenizing. You know, you can always kind of tell on those sites when it's like somebody with a thumbs up, right, and they're just doing that to tick a box. But I think this was a really powerful way they were able to add a touch of humanness, right, to a site that otherwise is pretty dry. And then the third item I want to talk about is crafting needs-based user flows. So the most important thing you can do, regardless of if there's mandates or not, right, is center your audience, guide them to the tasks and answers they care the most about. So how can you do this? First, you want to start with the need and not the org chart. I think this happens a lot. I also work a lot with higher ed clients, and this definitely happens a lot in that space too, where, you know, they say, my team's responsible for this, so I think it should be, you know, this, that. But really, users may not think that way, and they don't know your org chart, right? Like, we don't want people to need a master's degree on your org chart to be able to get to the information they need. So that's number one. The second is anticipate what's next moment. So at the end of each step, maybe guiding user to the next action they'll need. And we'll talk about this in the example on the side in a second. And you want to accommodate for multiple paths, right? So anytime that folks are either diving deeper into content or trying to complete a task, there's going to be many steps. And it's kind of like a choose your own adventure, right? Depending on what you choose, different options come up, and you want to try to avoid dead ends. So one tool that I think can be helpful sometimes if you're trying to kind of be put in that user mindset and break down steps, it's called goblin.tools, which is kind of funny. I think the intent is it was designed for folks who have executive dysfunction issues like ADHD, to be able to break down tasks into smaller chunks. But it actually is really helpful for this purpose too, to be able to like break down a flow, without having to think through every step. So for example, if my motivator is I need help paying my rent, right? If I'm a constituent, the things that are in the needs and steps that essentially are going to happen are, right, I need to determine if my county, for example, offers help. I need to understand the eligibility requirements. I need to then locate the application, submit the application, and check into my status, right? So that's kind of that anticipate what's next moments. We want to be thinking about what's coming next for these people. But at the same time, you also want to accommodate for multiple paths, right? And some examples of this are, for example, if you understand your eligibility requirements, right, that's a step, but you might not really fully understand and you're not sure if you qualify. Or I don't have all the necessary documents I need to complete this form, or, my application was denied, what's next? So these are kind of the accommodate for multiple steps that we also need to be thinking of in order to avoid those dead ends. This was an example I found. So this is Nashville, the city, but also Davidson County, which I guess is the city, the county it's in. And they have this services drop down. So using that same example we were looking at before, looking for rental assistance, I went to this menu and I was looking for where I would find it. First, I went to property services and I couldn't find what I was looking for. And so I just clicked on view all services. And the reality is that, just for context, this is how long the page is. And if you can see at the bottom, there's pagination, right? So they try and they say, there might be. There might be. That's probably also an editorial nightmare. But they have this little filter here, right? You can filter by department. But as you can see, that's a pretty long list, and I don't necessarily know the names of all these departments. So that's not super helpful. They do have a search, and so I just search for rent. And can folks spot where in here it's what we're looking for? But as you can see, right, as a user, and this is only part of the screenshot, there's even more options. So visually, it takes a lot of time to try to figure out where you're going. So what can you kind of do to work through some of this? One idea is to have hub pages. So we hear about gov.uk a lot as like a really great example of kind of a transformation. And for benefits, right, they have these hub pages essentially that are, instead of jumping directly to specific topics, they're trying to break the topics down into categories that are helpful for the user. So most viewed at the top and then the topics at the bottom, and that can be really helpful. We have worked on John Ossoff's, his Senate, the website he is targeted at constituents. And one of the patterns that we were able to add is on the homepage, right, how can we help? And then listing those services in popularity. So if you use the menu, you can actually click to view all services, but this is kind of grouped by the top questions that his office gets. We also have done a site for Alberta municipalities. They kind of help municipal folks be able to access different resources. And we actually created, right, it doesn't have to be in your primary navigation that you're doing these things, this kind of block where you can click down and select based on audience. And then you can also do by common questions. So this is an example. Oh, it has the Alberta logo, but it's not that. This is from the USCIS website. So if you're doing any immigration type stuff. And it was funny because I was interested to see, there's not a ton of sites that I've seen for government that are rolling out chatbots, etc. And they had one, and when I clicked on it, right, because chatbots can be a helpful way if they're set up well to get this information. But actually first I'm hit with this initiative they have, right, to let people self-deport. That's not really helpful because that's probably not what most people are going to this website to find. And it was already mentioned 15 other times on the page that this CTA was on. But right, the second screen, kind of when you move past that, can be a bit more helpful, and it even offers Spanish guidance. The other thing that I wanted to flag was you can use specific task search in top resources. So this is the Charlotte airport that I fly out of regularly, and they've actually created, right, they know most people are going to find their flights and figure out what gate it's on, so they've created this kind of finder that's built into their homepage so that it's kind of a custom search and folks don't have to go through a wide navigation. I think you also see a lot of this in higher ed, right, with folks saying search our programs, things like that. And then last but not least, you want to plan for change resilience. So you want to build structures that bend with change, not break. And the topics I want to talk about here are using hub pages. So we talked a little bit about that with gov.uk. And I think I wanted to take into account that all the great ideas I shared today, hopefully you agree, take time and they take effort and they take investment to create. And that's maybe not the reality most folks are dealing with. So if you can start with maybe transforming, right, some of your content, maybe 1 to 2 high demand topics, and creating a hub page, that's a good place to start. Ideally, too, you want to design modular content, right? So I think, assuming a lot of folks in here know about Drupal or are using Drupal for their sites, Drupal is very good at doing that, right? Whether you're using paragraphs or all the other different elements. Content can be really modular, but I think we saw the value of that when we were looking at that NOAA example where maybe they didn't have a component that kind of had an alert box and you kind of lost that visually, but if you have that, you can kind of add it. You can also essentially use that so that if you have to remove specific sections of content very quickly, you can do so and not have to dig through as much information. The other thing I wanted to flag is, it might be time to dust off your archival policies. I know with federal government sites, there is a lot of policy that already dictates this, right? You have to have your information available for FOIA requests, it's a Freedom of Information Act request and everything like that. So maybe you already have a process you're following and that's pretty well established. But if maybe you're working at a smaller organization or maybe not federal government, making sure that you have a process of how content gets archived is really, really important. Because as we kind of saw in that example from the CDC, right, content may need to be reinstated, like things will continue to change. And ultimately having an archive and having a history, right, of the things that have been changed can ensure some long-term transparency. And then last but not least, like automated monitoring. And now when I say all these things, I kind of think of these as like tactics for harm reduction almost. If folks are familiar with that term, I think typically it comes more with a different context. But what I mean by that is you may not have control over the policies that are changing, but instead of having to be stuck with the situation, kind of like all of those health sites had to do, where you have to massive take down content because you don't have the bandwidth or team to go through everything and edit, that can be a little bit of something you can leverage there. In order to be able to target specific sections of content rather than just whole web pages to kind of remediate quickly. So what I mean by that is that these are tools like, and the one I have most experience with is Site Improve, but I know that's quite pricey. But Acquia also has a product called Acquia Optimize that does this, where you can set up policies to find specific terms, etc., on your site when things come up. And this is really useful not just for, truly like emergent situations, but for example, I had a client in higher ed where after the pandemic, they removed their test optional kind of approach that they had done. And so they needed to quickly know where did we mention that this was our policy throughout the site so that they could update that and not have confusing information. The other way that you can do this, and I will not pretend to know I know how to set this up because I'm not a developer, but if you are using Drupal, you can use a combination of the Drupal Search API and views to kind of create custom ways to showcase that. So these were our ideas here, and the last takeaway, right, is we're still in charge of what remains. There's things we don't have control over, but we do have some power to create change-resilient, user-focused, and welcoming experiences, so we can really guide, support, and adapt to the user needs and the evolving landscape around us. And this is, as promised, the Evolve digital slide. So if you can make it to New York in November, please do. And yeah, that's about it. I think we have like 30 seconds left, but I don't know if folks have questions.